In the labyrinth of existence, where every turn presents a new challenge, we find ourselves often entangled in the webs of our own emotions. The human condition is fraught with the tumult of passions, the storms of desire, and the whispering voices of fear. Yet, amidst this chaos, there exists a beacon of unwavering strength and clarity, the Stoic philosophy, embodied in the life and teachings of Seneca the Younger. And remember, if you found this exploration of Stoic principles valuable and if you're interested in more content like this, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay updated on all our latest videos exploring timeless wisdom and practical strategies for living a fulfilling and disciplined life in today's world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay disciplined and stay inspired. Seneca, a towering figure in the annals of Stoic philosophy, was not merely a sage of ancient Rome but a guiding light for all who seek mastery over themselves. His life was a testament to the power of discipline, a force that forged his character in the crucible of adversity and shaped him into a paragon of virtue. In exploring Seneca's journey, we unravel the essence of Stoicism, the art of mastering the self. Born into a world of opulence and privilege, Seneca could have easily succumbed to the lures of excess and indulgence. Yet, he chose a different path, a path of discipline and inner fortitude. From his early years, he immersed himself in the teachings of Stoic philosophers, drawing wisdom from the likes of Zeno and Cleanthes. Through rigorous study and contemplation, Seneca cultivated a mind tempered like steel, resilient in the face of adversity. But it was not merely in the realm of theory that Seneca excelled, rather, it was in the crucible of real-life experiences that his true mettle was tested. Banished to the desolate island of Corsica by the whims of an unjust emperor, Seneca endured years of isolation and hardship. Yet, far from breaking his spirit, these trials only served to strengthen his resolve. In the solitude of exile, Seneca found solace in the teachings of his beloved Stoic philosophy, turning adversity into an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. It is said that the measure of a person's character is not determined by their circumstances but by their response to them. In this regard, Seneca stands as a paragon of virtue, exemplifying the Stoic ideal of mastering one's emotions. In his letters to his friend Lucilius, Seneca imparts timeless wisdom on the art of self-mastery, urging us to cultivate a mind that is impervious to the vicissitudes of fortune. Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body, Seneca wrote, reminding us that it is through adversity that we forge the sword of discipline. Like a skilled blacksmith, we must temper our souls in the fires of hardship, refining our character with each blow of fate. For it is not the absence of challenges that defines us but our response to them, with courage, resilience, and unwavering resolve. But discipline is not merely about enduring hardship, it is also about harnessing the power of our minds to overcome destructive emotions. Seneca teaches us that true freedom lies not in the pursuit of pleasure, but in the mastery of our desires. By cultivating a mind that is detached from worldly attachments, we attain a state of inner peace and tranquility, untouched by the storms of passion. In seeking wisdom, the first step is silence, the second listening, the third memory, the fourth practice, the fifth teaching others, Seneca wrote, encapsulating the essence of Stoic philosophy. It is through the practice of virtuous deeds that we attain true wisdom, embodying the principles of Stoicism in our daily lives. By living with integrity and moral clarity, we become beacons of light in a world shrouded in darkness. Yet, discipline is not a destination but a journey, a lifelong pursuit of self-improvement and self-discovery. Seneca reminds us that the path of virtue is fraught with obstacles, and we must constantly strive to overcome our weaknesses and vices. By cultivating habits of excellence and self-discipline, we inch ever closer to the ideal of the Stoic sage, a paragon of wisdom and virtue. In today's world, where the clamor of distractions threatens to drown out the voice of reason, the teachings of Seneca resonate more deeply than ever. In a culture obsessed with instant gratification and material wealth, Stoicism offers a path to inner fulfillment and spiritual enlightenment. By embracing the principles of discipline, we reclaim control over our lives and chart a course towards a brighter future. But the journey of self-mastery is not one that we undertake alone, rather, it is a collective endeavor, guided by the wisdom of those who have come before us. In the words of Seneca, we are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. By transcending our fears and embracing the challenges that lie ahead, we unlock the hidden potential within ourselves and forge a legacy that will endure for generations to come. In conclusion, the life of Seneca serves as a timeless testament to the power of discipline, a force that transcends the ages and inspires us to reach for the stars. In the words of the Stoic sage himself, it is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor. Let us heed his wisdom and embark on the journey of self-discovery, guided by the light of Stoic philosophy. For in the crucible of discipline, we find the true essence of our humanity, noble, resilient, and unyielding in the face of adversity. And remember, if you found this exploration of Stoic principles valuable and if you're interested in more content like this, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay updated on all our latest videos exploring timeless wisdom and practical strategies for living a fulfilling and disciplined life in today's world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay disciplined and stay inspired. In the hushed corridors of history, there emerges a figure shrouded in the veils of wisdom and discipline, Seneca, the Stoic sage whose legacy transcends epochs. His life, forged in the crucible of adversity, resonates with the timeless truths of Stoicism, offering us a beacon of light in the labyrinth of our own struggles. We, as seekers of inner fortitude, must heed the whispers of Seneca's teachings, for within them lie the keys to unlock the shackles of our destructive emotions and cultivate the unyielding discipline of the soul. In the annals of time, Seneca's life stands as a testament to the transformative power of discipline. Born in the crucible of Rome's golden age, he bore witness to the capricious whims of fate and the tumultuous currents of power. Yet amidst the tempest of his era, Seneca remained steadfast in his pursuit of virtue, anchoring himself to the principles of Stoicism like a sturdy ship amidst raging seas. As we delve into the depths of Seneca's philosophy, we unearth the cornerstone of his teachings, the cultivation of discipline. For Seneca, discipline was not merely an abstract concept, but a way of life, an unwavering commitment to the mastery of one's desires and emotions. In his magnum opus, Letters to a Stoic, Seneca implores us to wield the sword of self-discipline with unyielding resolve, for it is through discipline that we ascend to the heights of virtue and inner peace. He writes, "True happiness is to enjoy the present, without anxious dependence upon the future, not to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is sufficient, for he that is so wants nothing. The greatest blessings of mankind are within us and within our reach. A wise man is content with his lot, whatever it may be, without wishing for what he has not." These words, etched in the annals of wisdom, serve as a clarion call to embrace the discipline of the present moment, to relinquish the shackles of desire and embrace the serenity of acceptance. But Seneca's teachings transcend mere theoretical musings, they are forged in the crucible of lived experience. As a statesman in the court of Nero, Seneca navigated the treacherous waters of power with the stoic resolve of a seasoned sailor. Though beset by the tempests of political intrigue and moral decay, Seneca remained steadfast in his commitment to virtue, a beacon of moral clarity amidst the gathering shadows. Yet, Seneca's journey was not without its trials and tribulations. In the twilight of his life, he faced the specter of his own mortality with the unwavering gaze of a Stoic philosopher. Condemned to death by his former pupil, Emperor Nero, Seneca met his fate with a courage that transcended the mortal realm. In his final moments, Seneca's words echoed across the ages, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human soul. He wrote, "Life, if well lived, is long enough." These words, spoken from the lips of a man facing imminent death, encapsulate the essence of Seneca's philosophy, the triumph of the indomitable spirit over the frailty of flesh. As we stand at the threshold of our own lives, let us heed the wisdom of Seneca's teachings. Let us embrace the discipline of the present moment, the unyielding resolve to master our desires and emotions. For in the crucible of discipline, we forge the steel of our souls, unbreakable and resolute in the face of adversity. In the labyrinth of modern life, where distractions abound and the pace of existence seems to quicken with each passing day, the timeless wisdom of Stoic philosophy offers a beacon of clarity and guidance. As we navigate the complexities of the digital age, the principles of Stoicism remain as relevant as ever, providing us with a roadmap to cultivate discipline and fortitude in our daily lives. 1. Practice mindfulness. At the heart of Stoic philosophy lies the practice of mindfulness, the art of living in the present moment with awareness and intention. In a world filled with constant stimulation and information overload, cultivating mindfulness allows us to anchor ourselves in the here and now, free from the grip of past regrets or future anxieties. By paying attention to our thoughts, emotions, and sensations without judgment, we develop a greater sense of self-awareness and inner peace. 2. Embrace virtue ethics. Stoicism teaches us that true happiness lies not in the pursuit of external pleasures or material wealth but in the cultivation of inner virtue. By aligning our actions with the cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, we lead lives of integrity and moral clarity. In the face of ethical dilemmas or moral challenges, we can turn to these virtues as guiding principles to inform our decisions and actions. 3. Practice acceptance. The Stoics believed in the concept of amor fati, the love of fate, which entails accepting the circumstances of our lives with equanimity and grace. While we may not always have control over external events or outcomes, we do have control over how we choose to respond to them. By embracing the principle of acceptance, we free ourselves from the burden of resentment or resistance, allowing us to focus our energy on what is within our power to change. 4. Cultivate resilience. Stoicism teaches us to view adversity as an opportunity for growth and self-improvement. Rather than being overwhelmed by life's challenges, we can approach them with a mindset of resilience and perseverance. By reframing obstacles as opportunities to test and strengthen our character, we develop the inner fortitude to weather life's storms with grace and dignity. 5. Practice self-discipline. In a world of instant gratification and constant temptation, cultivating self-discipline is more important than ever. Stoicism teaches us to exercise restraint and moderation in all aspects of our lives, whether it be in our consumption habits, our relationships, or our daily routines. By practicing self-discipline, we develop the inner strength to resist distractions and stay focused on our goals and values. 6. Maintain perspective. Stoicism encourages us to adopt a broader perspective on life, recognizing the impermanence of all things and the interconnectedness of the universe. By cultivating a sense of perspective, we can overcome the tendency to magnify our problems or dwell on petty grievances. Instead, we can appreciate the beauty and complexity of existence, finding solace in the knowledge that we are but small players in the grand tapestry of life. 7. Practice gratitude. Finally, Stoicism teaches us the importance of cultivating an attitude of gratitude towards life. By acknowledging and appreciating the blessings that surround us, whether it be our health, our relationships, or the beauty of the natural world, we cultivate a sense of contentment and fulfillment that transcends material wealth or external success. Gratitude reminds us of the richness and abundance of life, even in the midst of adversity or hardship. In conclusion, the principles of Stoicism offer a timeless guide to cultivating discipline and fortitude in the modern world. By practicing mindfulness, embracing virtue ethics, practicing acceptance, cultivating resilience, practicing self-discipline, maintaining perspective, and practicing gratitude, we can navigate life's challenges with grace and dignity, leading lives of purpose, integrity, and inner peace. As we embark on this journey of self-discovery and self-improvement, let us heed the wisdom of the Stoics and strive to embody their timeless ideals in our daily lives.